Chapter 1. A voice echoes in Rosehill. The afternoon sun lay golden over the thatched roofs and curling lanes of Rosehill. A village so peaceful it might have been drawn from the pages of an old children's book. Church bells chimed the half-hour, echoing softly across hedgerows and down narrow footpaths. It was a Thursday in June, and the air smelled of elderflower and fresh-cut grass. Inside the Rosehill Women's Institute Hall, there was the pleasant hum of conversation and the clatter of teacups. Dozens of women, mostly in floral prints and soft cardigans, sat at tables adorned with homemade sponge cakes and neatly cut sandwiches. The meeting had just concluded, and now came the best part. The gossip Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly in the corner near the window, stirred her tea with unhurried grace. She wore a pale gray cardigan and a matching hat adorned with a fading piece of lavender ribbon. At first glance, she was easily overlooked, a sweet-faced elderly lady with an almost absent-minded air. But those who knew her surely knew. Her understood that behind those pale blue eyes ticked a mind sharp enough to unpick the threads of any tangled human story. Across the room, Mrs. Geraldine Brent, head of the committee, tapped her spoon against a teacup. "Well then," she said brightly, "before we all toddle off, don't forget the charity jumble sales this Saturday. And please, no more musty old fur stoles this year, Edna. The moths were positively frolicking in them." Polite laughter rippled through the room, but the laughter was interrupted not by sound, but by a strange silence. It came when Ivy Walker, the vicar's timid housekeeper, dropped a teacup. It shattered against the floor. Her hand trembled. Her face, always pale, had turned a strange, blotchy pink. I'm sorry," she whispered, already crouching to clean it up. "Clumsy of me?" A few women leaned down to help her, but Miss Marple didn't move. She watched Ivy closely, not with pity, but with care. There was something peculiar in Ivy's posture, the way she bent low, not only from embarrassment, but from fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew, wasn't born. From broken china, Geraldine cleared her throat. "Ivy, dear, it's just a cup. No need to faint dead away." But Ivy only nodded and muttered an apology before excusing herself. She left the hall quickly, leaving the door swinging behind her like a question left unanswered. Miss Marple turned back to her tea, a thoughtful frown on her brow. An hour later, the hall had emptied, and Rosehill returned to its usual rhythm. Bicycles hummed past hedges. The postman whistled as he pushed letters into brass slots, and the sun sank just a little lower behind the hills. But by evening, the village peace would be broken. Just after supper, at Maple House, an old Georgian residence set slightly back from the main lane, piercing scream ripped through the stillness. It came from Ivy Walker. Again. This time, it wasn't a broken teacup. It was a body, and the sound of glass, not breaking, but cracking slowly as if under pressure, came from the tall gilt-framed mirror in the hallway. Later, many would say, it was the mirror that started it all. The mirror, and the voice Ivy swore she heard whispering her name. Chapter 2. The mirror whispers again. The mirror stood tall in the dim hallway of Maple House, its gilded frame curling like ivy, ornate and old. For decades it had hung between the grandfather clock and the polished sideboard, silently reflecting coats, hats, and the occasional curious guest. But tonight it reflected something else entirely. A man's body. He lay crumpled at the foot of the stairs, face turned to one side, one hand twisted oddly beneath him, the other reaching toward the wall as though trying to grasp something in his final moment. His neck was at an unnatural angle. Mr. Lionel Maddox, 52, former naval officer, recently retired to Rosehill with a sort of brisk, authoritarian charm that split opinion clean down the middle. Some found him refreshingly direct. Others particularly the women of the Institute, whispered that he was a brute cloaked in politeness, a man who liked control, a man with a temper, and now a dead man. The police arrived promptly. Sergeant Tom Fletcher, a man in his early 30s with a slight stoop and a gentle voice, was the first on the scene. He ducked under the threshold and took in the room with professional unease. Ivy Walker sat in the corner, wrapped in a crocheted shawl, hands trembling. Her eyes were wide and dry, blinking fast as though trying to erase what she had seen. I didn't mean to scream," she murmured. The house was so still, and I was bringing in the last tray from supper. Then I saw." Her voice faltered. She looked toward the mirror again, then looked away, shuddering. "What did you see?" Sergeant Fletcher asked gently. Ivy hesitated. "At first, I didn't see him, just the reflection. In the glass, I thought—" her breath quickened. "I thought it was someone else entirely." "Someone else?" he prompted. She swallowed. "A woman." The room went silent. Outside. News of the death traveled as fast as bicycles and back doors could carry it. Within the hour, half the village knew Lionel Maddox had fallen down the stairs at Maple House, and Ivy Walker had found him. By morning, the whispering would begin. But for now, Miss Marple sat quietly by her hearth in Church Lane Cottage, her knitting in her lap untouched, her radio murmuring faintly in the corner. A cup of cocoa rested on the small table beside her. She hadn't yet changed for bed. She had heard the scream too, sharp and distant, and had stood at her garden gate just long enough to watch the constable's car speed toward Maple House. Now, as the clock struck 11, she replayed the afternoon in her mind. The broken teacup. The fear in Ivy's face. The mirror. There was something very particular about mirrors, she thought. Not just the way they reflected, but what they chose to reflect. People often forgot that mirrors could be deceptive, depending on the light and angle. They could hide as much as they revealed. And there was something else. She had met Lionel Maddox only twice, once at the garden fete, and once outside the greengrocer's. He had seemed courteous, even affable. But there had been something in the way Ivy lowered her eyes when he passed, the same way a bird flinches when a shadow crosses the ground. A memory stirred in Miss Marple's mind, something long ago. A friend in St. Mary Mead who had once spoken of her employer in the same soft, nervous tones. That had not ended well either. Miss Marple rose, crossed the room, and turned off the radio. She did not believe in ghosts or voices in mirrors, but she did believe in fear. And in Rosehill, she sensed that fear had been living quietly, hidden, behind lace curtains, polished silver, and polite Sunday greetings for quite some time. Only now had it found its voice. Chapter 3. A village full of secrets. By the following morning, Rosehill had transformed. Not in appearance. The hedges were still neatly trimmed. The post office still opened precisely at 8, and the birds still sang as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension threaded into the fabric of every morning routine. Conversations dropped to whispers when footsteps approached. Windows were open just enough to listen, not to let. In the breeze. At the Rosehill Bakery, the usual queue for warm scones was longer than usual. But no one was talking about bread. "I heard he'd been drinking," murmured Mrs. Penelope Trott, pretending to inspect a raspberry tart. "Fell down the stairs, just like that." "Nonsense," sniffed Mr. Graves, the butcher's assistant, standing behind her. "You don't break your neck falling down 4 shallow steps unless you're pushed." "And what about the mirror?" asked Lydia Hartwell, the schoolteacher. Ivy swears she heard a voice in the glass. "She's not the type to invent stories." "Poor girl," Penelope whispered. "She's been with the vicar for 10 years. Quiet as a lamb, never even looked at a man twice. "I don't know," Mr. Graves muttered. "Maybe now we'll find out what really went on inside Maple House. That man never seemed ... right." Back at Church Lane Cottage, Miss Marple had finished her breakfast, porridge and half a boiled egg, and had settled in her favorite chair beside the parlor window. She had a notebook open beside her, though it was mostly blank. So far, she had written only a few names: Lionel Maddox, Ivy Walker, Maple House. The Mirror. She tapped the pencil against the page. Her cat, Tibby, dozed peacefully beside her. There was a knock at the door. "Come in, dear," she called. The door opened, and in stepped Reverend Peter Lomax, Ivy's employer. A tall, thin man in his early 60s, he carried himself with the weary dignity of a shepherd, perpetually tending to a troubled flock. His clerical collar sat slightly askew. "I thought you might have questions, Miss Marple," he said gently, removing his hat. "I was just thinking of calling on you," she replied. "How is Ivy this morning?" "Distraught, shaken, but no longer incoherent, thank the Lord." He sat down across from her and looked momentarily out the window, gathering his thoughts. "She told me something strange," he continued, "last night, after the police left. I wasn't going to repeat it, but, well, you've always had a way of seeing things the rest of us miss." Miss Marple smiled modestly and waited. She said the voice she heard in the mirror wasn't Lionel Maddox's. It was a woman's voice, calling her name. Clear as a bell, indeed. And when she turned, she said the reflection didn't match the room. The hallway behind her was wrong somehow. It showed the staircase, but without Lionel's body at the bottom. And there was someone standing at the top. Miss Marple didn't flinch. And what did she say about the figure? She couldn't see the face, but it wore something red. That much she was certain of. Miss Marple looked down at her. Notes and added, red garment figure atop of stairs, wrong reflection. She folded the notebook closed. Did Ivy ever speak of Mr. Maddox in any particular way? Reverend Lomax hesitated, not in words, but I always sensed a dread in her when he was mentioned. I suppose I didn't press hard enough to know why. And Mrs. Maddox died 5 years ago. He moved here not long after. Said he wanted peace and privacy. Miss Marple nodded. That was often what men like Lionel Maddox said. Peace and privacy, which often meant no one to watch them too closely. Later that day, Miss Marple walked to Maple House. The front gate was closed, a police notice pinned to the post. She paused for only a moment, looking up at the elegant brick facade. A shadow moved behind the curtain in the upper window. For a second, she thought someone was watching, but when she looked again, there was only the glass, and in it, she saw her own reflection, still, quiet, and alone, just as mirrors preferred. Chapter 4. The Man with Too Many Stories. The next morning brought a cold drizzle that draped itself over Rosehill like a damp shawl. Windows fogged, garden gates creaked in the wind, and umbrellas bloomed along the high street like black mushrooms. But despite the weather, villagers were out and talking. Lionel Maddox's death, whether tragic accident or something darker, had stirred the sort of excitement that only a village mystery could. And now, a new figure had become the center of attention. Benedict Benny, Clough. Benny, was not from Rosehill. He had arrived just 6 weeks prior, taking up residence in a modest rented room above the Clock and Hare, the local pub. Supposedly, he was writing a book. A novel of rural life, he told anyone who asked. But the pub regulars weren't so sure. He says he's a writer, muttered Norman Fry, the pub landlord, as he polished glasses that didn't need polishing. But he drinks like a man hiding something. He knows too much, added Elsie Travers, sitting at the bar, with her usual half-pint. Yesterday he said he'd seen Maddox arguing with someone. A woman. But when I asked who, He changed the subject. When Miss Marple entered the pub that afternoon, gently drying her shoes on the mat, her umbrella neatly folded, the conversation hushed. Not out of rudeness, but habit. Miss Marple had a way of bringing clarity to muddy waters. And clarity, in Rosehill right now, was something people weren't sure they wanted. She approached the bar and greeted Norman warmly. "I wonder," she said, "might I have a cup of tea and a moment's chat with your upstairs tenant?" Norman blinked, then gave a nod. "He's up there now, tapping away like a madman. I'll send him down." 5 minutes later, Benny Clough descended the staircase, wearing a rumpled jumper and carrying a notebook stained with coffee rings. He had untamed hair and sharp eyes, the kind that scanned a room quickly and missed nothing. "Miss Marple," he said, managing both curiosity and wariness in a single breath. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I was hoping you could help me," she replied gently, "with something delicate." They took a quiet corner near the fireplace. "I've been told," she began, "that you witnessed Mr. Maddox in a disagreement not long ago." "A woman was mentioned?" Benny gave a crooked smile. "Word gets around in this village faster than milk turns. But is it true?" He leaned back in his chair, toying with his pen. "I suppose it depends on what you mean by disagreement. I saw him speaking with a woman outside the chemist's last week. She looked upset, very upset. He was leaning in close. I remember thinking it didn't look like a lover's quarrel. More like blackmail. Do you know who she was? Ivy Walker." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "And you're sure?" He nodded, recognized her immediately. "I see her at the vicarage sometimes. Quiet little thing. But that day?" Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. "She said something, just a few words, but I caught it." "What was it?" He hesitated. "You said you'd stop." Miss Marple's knitting bag shifted slightly in her lap. "Did she see you watching?" "Doubt it. I was behind the florist's van. Coincidence, really. But I remember Maddox's face. He looked ... smug, like a man who enjoyed being begged." "Thank you, Mr. Clough." As she prepared to leave, Benny leaned forward. "You really think she had something to do with it?" "Ivy, I mean." Miss Marple looked at him calmly. "I think, Mr. Clough, that pain and guilt are not always found in the same place. But both leave a shadow." As she stepped back out into the drizzle, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage with a growing sense of unease. Ivy's fear was no longer a mystery dot, it was a symptom. And Lionel Maddox, it seemed, had given more than one. Woman in Rosehill, a reason to whisper. But someone had stopped whispering. Someone had acted. Chapter 5. The Red Thread in the Parlor at Maple. House had been sealed since the night of Lionel Maddox's death. A blue cordon draped across the doorway, like a ribbon on a forbidden's gift, and a musty stillness clung to the walls. But that morning, Miss Marple, escorted by Sergeant Fletcher, was granted a brief, quiet visit. She stepped inside without ceremony, letting her eyes adjust to the dusky light that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains. The air smelled faintly of furniture polish and something metallic, the echo of a recent crime. "Much as it looked when we found him," Fletcher said, voice low. Body was at the bottom of the stairs. Nothing out of place, really. No signs of a struggle. Just dead. Miss Marple said nothing. She moved slowly around the room, her fingers clasped loosely in front of her, eyes grazing across the details. She stopped before the long gilt mirror in the hallway, tall, narrow, and curved at the corners. "This mirror," she murmured, "has stood here quite a long time, hasn't it? About 40 years, according to the neighbors." She stared into it. Her own reflection stared back, pale, composed, gently wrinkled. But it was the frame she studied most. Carved roses. A tiny chip at the top right. Faint fingerprints along the bottom. "Funny thing," Fletcher added. We checked for signs it had been moved or tampered with. Nothing. No wires, no speakers, no tricks. And yet Ivy swears she heard a voice. Miss Marple turned toward him. People often do, when they've heard something else first. Something. Inside. Something they've tried very hard not to listen to. She moved to the parlor door and let her fingers drift across the polished wood of a side table. Something snagged. She looked down. A single red thread dot almost invisible against the dark wood. It curled like a fallen hair, fine and delicate. But red, deep, blood red. Did Mr. Maddox ever wear scarlet? Fletcher shook his head. Navy, always navy or brown. Bit of a uniform habit. Miss Marple plucked the thread carefully and held it up to the light. And someone else was here that night, she said softly. Someone who wasn't seen. Back at Church Lane Cottage, the thread lay in a small envelope beside her notebook. Miss Marple sat with a fresh cup of tea and her thoughts. She added to the list. Red thread gives not Maddox Ivy, plus Maddox argument mirror voice equals fear memory. Benny Clough gives unreliable narrator. She paused. Benny had given information, useful information, but with the air of someone offering it too freely. Writers, she knew, often got caught in their own narratives. And he'd claimed to overhear Ivy's exact words? Curious, she turned to another name, Charlotte Blackwell, a name whispered by Mrs. Hartwell, the schoolteacher, earlier that week. She and Maddox were close once, Hartwell had said, voice low, when he first arrived. But she stopped coming. To the Institute meetings, quietly distanced herself. Miss Marple decided she'd take a walk to Blackwell's drapery the next morning. Charlotte was not a woman given to dramatics, which made her silence all the more interesting. But just before she retired for the night, a soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find Ivy Walker, drenched from the rain, eyes hollow. Miss Marple, she whispered, I need to tell someone before I go mad. Come in, dear. Ivy stepped inside, water dripping from her coat. I keep hearing it, she said. Not just that night. Again and again. The voice in the mirror. It says, she gulped, pressing a shaking hand to her lips. It says he knows. Miss Marple set down her teacup with care. Then perhaps, she said gently, it's time we found out who else knows. Chapter 6. Charlotte and the Draper Secret. The next morning dawned gray and still. Rain had softened the village lanes, turning the earth to velvet and silencing even the birds. Miss Marple, wrapped in a lilac shawl and sturdy walking shoes, made her way down Fallow Lane toward Blackwell's drapery and Notions, a narrow little shop that had stood in Rosehill for over 30 years. Surviving 2 floods, 1 roof collapse, and the arrival of the supermarket in nearby Windermere. The bell above the door gave a hesitant chime as she entered. Inside, the air smelled of lavender sachets and old cotton. Bolts of fabric stood in tall rows along the wall, floral prints, winter wools, and lace edging. At the far end, behind a well-worn counter, stood Charlotte Blackwell. She was in her mid-40s, with a tall frame and a chignon so tight it seemed it might hold her upright by sheer will. Her blouse was crisp, her voice clipped. But when she looked up and saw Miss Marple, something flickered behind her eyes. Not quite surprise, not quite dread. Miss Marple, she said, her hands pausing mid-fold over a swatch of plum corduroy. I didn't expect a customer so early. I do hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple replied with a warm smile. But I heard your shop carries the best thread in the county. I've run out of crimson. Charlotte hesitated, then reached beneath the counter and produced a small wooden drawer of spools. Silk or cotton? Cotton, dear. Miss Marple let her gaze linger casually across the display. So many shades of red, she said. One would think no two threads ever told the same story. Charlotte didn't answer. Miss Marple continued, gently. Did you know Lionel Maddox well? There was a pause, sharp and silent. I knew him, Charlotte said at last. As most in this village did. But better than most? A flicker of anger now. Or was it pain? If you've come to PR, why? I haven't, dear. Only to understand. Charlotte drew in a breath and folded her hands atop the counter. He was charming at first. That way some men are. Confident, generous, full of praise. You think they've noticed something in you others haven't. But really, it's just a hook. Miss Marple gave a soft nod. He asked for help choosing curtains, Charlotte continued bitterly. Came in 3 times a week for 2 months. And once he had what he wanted, the right tone of navy velvet for his study, he lost interest in the drapery, and in everything else. He made promises? Charlotte let out a small, hollow laugh. Oh, not marriage. Nothing so old-fashioned. But he had a way of owning people, Miss Marple. A look, a comment, half-joking. You began to doubt your own judgment. And then, she stopped, catching herself. And then? Miss Marple prompted, softly. Charlotte met her eyes, steady now. Then he began visiting Ivy. Miss Marple remained. Very still. You knew? I saw, once, him coming out of the vicarage garden gate after dusk. Ivy was standing in the doorway, white as a sheet. She never told anyone, but I think she knew I saw. And you never said anything? Charlotte's face hardened. What good would it have done? She was frightened. And I was ashamed. For not stopping it. For letting him twist me too. The room felt close now, thick with unsaid things. I have something to show you, Miss Marple said. She reached into her bag and produced a small envelope, drawing out the red thread found. In Maple House. Charlotte's breath caught. Is this yours? Charlotte looked down at it, stared for a long moment. That's from our scarlet drapery twill, she said quietly. Only 2 bolts left, not popular lately. Too bold. Has anyone bought it recently? Charlotte's eyes narrowed. Yes, a woman. 2 weeks ago. Just 1.5 meters. She said she was making a scarf, I think. Do you recall who? Charlotte hesitated. It was raining. She wore a hood. Paid in cash. I didn't catch her name. Miss Marple folded the thread back into its envelope. Her thoughts were running fast now, sharp and quiet as scissors through cloth. A voice in the mirror. A red thread in the parlor. A woman hiding in plain sight. And perhaps, most chilling of all, a secret that 2 women had shared in silence. Chapter 7. Tea with the vicar's wife. It was just past 4 o'clock when Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage. Her coat damp from a passing shower, her umbrella neatly folded and tied. The garden, usually neat and cheerful, looked tired. Today, as though wilting under the strain of recent events. Mrs. Hester Lomax, the vicar's wife, opened the door with her usual warm smile, though it wavered at the edges. Miss Marple, she said, surprised but not unwelcoming. Do come in. You look chilled. Only on the outside, dear, Miss Marple replied, stepping into the hallway. I wonder, might I trouble you for a small cup of tea? Of course. Hester led her into the sitting room, a comfortable, well-kept space lined with religious prints and well-worn hymnals. A kettle was already on, the table laid with shortbread and a small pot of plum jam. Miss Marple removed her gloves and settled herself neatly in the corner armchair. I was just preparing a tray for Ivy, Hester said. She's barely eaten. Poor soul. She's still here, then? Oh, yes, we insisted. She's in no state to be alone. There was a pause as tea was poured, the soft chime of china filling the room. Ivy has always been so dependable, Hester continued. Quiet, devout. You wouldn't think. She stopped herself, coloring. Forgive me. I don't know what I think anymore. That's quite understandable, said Miss Marple, accepting her cup. Ivy's been carrying something heavy, I fear, for quite some time. Hester's shoulders dropped slightly. You believe her, then? About the voice in the mirror? I believe that fear can echo, Mrs. Lomax, and that mirrors often reflect. More than just our appearance. Hester's lips tightened. Peter thinks it's shock, a collapse of the nerves. But I wonder, yes? Hester leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. Last summer, I noticed a bruise on Ivy's wrist. Just a glimpse. She dropped a tray and reached for it too quickly. She pulled her sleeve down the moment she saw I'd noticed. Did you ask her? I did, gently. She smiled and said she'd slipped on the kitchen tiles. Hester shook her head. But there was something about the way she said it. Like a child trying to protect someone else. Miss Marple took a careful sip of her tea. Did she ever mention Lionel Maddox? Never. But I saw them speak once, at the flower festival. He took her by the elbow, not roughly, but firmly, spoke into her ear, and she just nodded, her eyes on the ground. Miss Marple placed her teacup down with a soft clink. Mrs. Lomax, she said quietly, may I speak with Ivy? Hester hesitated. She's not well, you understand. She hardly speaks. All the more reason. The vicar's wife studied her for a long moment, then gave a solemn nod. She's upstairs. First room on the right. Miss Marple stood, smoothed her skirt, and ascended the stairs slowly. The landing was quiet, the air faintly scented with lavender water. At the door, she knocked gently. Ivy? It's Miss Marple. May I come in? There was a long pause, then a faint voice. Yes. Inside, the curtains were drawn, and Ivy sat at the edge of a small bed, a shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked not just frightened, but empty, like someone drained of color. I've brought you a little company, Miss Marple said, settling into the chair opposite. And perhaps a little peace. Ivy gave a weak smile, then looked down again. I'm not mad, she whispered. I know people think I am. But I heard her. In the mirror. And I saw. Saw who, dear? Ivy's lips trembled. Myself. Miss Marple blinked gently. Yourself? In the reflection. Standing at the top of the stairs. Wearing something red. I don't own anything red. Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet thud. The thread. The red thread. Do you remember anything else? Ivy nodded slowly. The voice said my name. And then it said, You're not safe anymore. Miss Marple sat very still. Do you feel unsafe, Ivy? Tears welled up now, but still no sobs. Just a slow, silent overflow. She nodded. I thought, after he died, I thought I would feel free. But now I feel watched. Like someone knows what I did. What did you do? Ivy looked up, eyes wide. Nothing, I swear. I didn't push him. I didn't touch him. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. But you were afraid of him. Yes, because of what he did? Ivy's hands gripped the shawl like a lifeline. He said if I told anyone, he'd say I made it up, that I was obsessed, that I'd tried to seduce him. He said people would believe him. And now, he's gone. But someone else knows, I think. She hesitated, then whispered, I think someone else wanted him dead even more than I did. Miss Marple rose and placed a comforting hand on Ivy's shoulder. I believe you, she said quietly. And you're not alone. As she stepped back out into the hallway, the mirror on the landing caught her reflection once more. But this time, for just a moment, just a heartbeat. She saw something else in it, too. A shape in the background, not watching, not waiting. Chapter 8. A letter torn in two. The rain had passed by morning, leaving Rosehill bathed in a soft, damp silence. The village green sparkled faintly beneath dew, and chimney smoke curled gently into the pale sky. Yet the calm was only surface deep. Beneath the stillness, something dark was stirring at Church Lane Cottage. Miss Marple sat by her fireside, with her notebook open and a pot of Earl Grey close at hand. The fire crackled softly, but her mind was elsewhere, retracing every thread. Mirror, the voice, the figure in red, the fear in Ivy's eyes. And now, something unspoken. Something shared. She'd seen it before. A village holding its breath, as though waiting for someone else to name what everyone sensed. That kind of silence was never natural. It was cultivated by shame, by fear, or by guilt. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Standing outside, slightly out of breath, was Peter Wren, the village postmaster's son, 14, bright-eyed, always in too much of a hurry. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "This was found at the edge of the cricket field. Father said it might be rubbish, but I thought you might want to see it." He handed her a torn envelope, damp at the edges, with part of a letter still tucked inside, no address. No signature. Just 2 sheets of paper, folded unevenly, and ripped through the center dot. She laid the pieces out on the table and began reading. Fragment 1. "You promised it would end. You said she meant nothing, that you would leave her alone. But you didn't. You watched her. You touched her arm again in public. You wanted to be seen. Not love. It was control, power, and you used it like a blade. If you come near her again, I swear. Fragment 2, red scarf. That's how I'll know. I'll stand on the corner opposite the pharmacy. You will look at me. You will listen this time. And if you don't, then you'll find out what fear really feels like. You're not the only one who can play games." Miss Marple read the fragments twice more, then folded them carefully and slipped them into a small leather folder. A red scarf, a meeting, a threat. The language was emotional, personal. Someone with intimate knowledge of Lionel Maddox. Someone who saw what he had done to Ivy and wasn't content to stay silent. She stood and fetched her coat. There was one person in Rosehill known for fine scarves and quiet anger. Someone overlooked, but observant. Someone who had once stood in the wings of Lionel's life, and then vanished from it. Charlotte. Blackwell. The bell above Blackwell's drapery gave its usual melancholy chime as Miss Marple entered. Charlotte looked up, back again. "I found something," Miss Marple said simply, "and I thought you ought to see it." She placed the letter fragments on the counter. Charlotte didn't move at first. Then, slowly, her fingers reached out and touched the torn edge of the paper. Her expression didn't change. But her voice, when she spoke, was taut. "Where did you get this?" "In the grass behind the cricket field." Charlotte's hands curled into fists. "I burned it," she whispered. "I tore it and burned it the night before he died. I didn't send it. I couldn't." Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "But you wrote it?" Charlotte gave a single, exhausted nod. "I was angry, furious, not just for what he did to me, but to Ivy. I saw how frightened she was. I wanted to frighten him, to make him see what he'd done. You wore red." Charlotte closed her eyes. "A red scarf, silk. I stood across from the pharmacy, just like the letter said. He saw me, smirked, and walked away like it was all a game." Miss Marple waited. "I didn't kill him," Charlotte said, her voice cracking now. "I wanted to shame him, maybe ruin his reputation. But murder?" She shook her head violently. "No, Miss Marple. I wanted him to live long enough to feel small, humiliated. I didn't want him dead." Miss Marple believed her. Anger could spark a letter, But murder required something deeper, something colder or more desperate. "I believe you, dear," she said quietly. "But someone else knew about this letter. Someone who retrieved what you tried to destroy." Charlotte looked up, horrified. "You think someone found it?" Miss Marple gave a solemn nod, and used it, not as a threat, but as a curtain. "A curtain? To hide behind." The killer made it look like your anger boiled over. Charlotte stared at her, stunned. "But that means," she whispered, "someone wanted me to take the blame." Outside, the wind rattled the shop window. And Miss Marple, already turning toward the door, felt the case shift. A red scarf, a broken man, a village full of silences, and someone, somewhere in Rosehill, who had made a very deliberate choice. Chapter 9. The scent of camphor and lies. The scent of camphor was unmistakable. Miss Marple detected it the moment she stepped into the small sitting room at Rosehill Manor, the stately house turned care home on the edge of the village. It clung to the curtains, the armchairs, to the old wool coats folded neatly at the foot of beds. It was here that Mrs. Eliza Stone, a lifelong Rosehill resident and former housemaid at Maple House, had lived out her final years, until her passing 3 months earlier. Miss Marple had only visited once before, but now she had a question nagging at the edge of memory, something about Eliza Stone's quiet, careful eyes and the story she once told in a garden long ago. A story about secrets in wardrobes and things left behind. "I'm looking for her belongings," Miss Marple explained gently to the matron, Mrs. Calloway, a no-nonsense woman with a clipboard and a kind heart. "Just a few papers, perhaps. Something she mentioned to me in passing. I believe she kept a box under her bed." Mrs. Calloway frowned, flipping through a log. "Well, we've just cleared her room. Everything boxed and labeled. There was an old cedar chest. Smelled of mothballs. We were going to pass it to the parish. Would you mind terribly if I took a quick look?" Mrs. Calloway hesitated, then gave a shrug. "Why not? Come along." The box was brought up from the storage room. Cedarwood, brass latch, hinges. Slightly rusted. Miss Marple sat before it like an archaeologist at a dig site and opened the lid. Inside were odds and ends, a bundle of church programs, old rosary beads, a newspaper clipping of the Queen's Jubilee. But it was something. Tucked in the side, beneath a folded shawl that caught her breath, a pair of gloves, white kid leather, immaculately preserved and stained faintly at the fingertips with something dark. Not fresh blood, but a reddish-brown smear, as though someone had once wiped their hands, quickly, carelessly, and then hidden the gloves away. Beneath, the gloves folded twice and pressed flat, was a sheet of stationery. Handwritten, spidery, dated March 12th, the day before Eliza's passing. "To whom it may concern, there is something I never told anyone. Not the vicar, not even Ivy. I saw Mr. Maddox do something terrible. It was years ago. A girl from the village. I won't name her. He cornered her near the orchard path behind Maple House. I was pruning the roses. He didn't see me. She cried after, but she said nothing. And I said nothing. I thought, if I kept it silent, it would die with time. But I was wrong. Some silences grow teeth. I kept the gloves. They were his. He dropped them that day. I wanted to throw them away, but I didn't. They seemed to belong to the truth. And now, as I feel death near, I want someone, anyone, to know. I was a coward, but not blind. Miss Marple sat in silence for nearly a minute. Then she carefully refolded the letter, returned the gloves to the box, and stood. By the time she arrived back at Church Lane Cottage, dusk was falling. The shadows had begun to stretch across the cobbled paths, and the village once again felt like it was holding its breath. Miss Marple placed the gloves on her writing desk and lit the lamp. The circle was tightening now. Eliza had witnessed the beginning. Ivy had endured the middle. Charlotte had tried to end it, but someone else, someone clever, patient, and watching, had taken matters into their own hands and used all the pieces, Ivy's fear, Charlotte's anger, Eliza's silence, to construct a lie that looked like justice, but justice, Miss Marple knew, never wore. Blood-stained gloves. She opened her notebook and began a fresh page. Suspects with motive. Charlotte Blackwell is anger. Humiliation Ivy Walker gives fear. Abuse unknown third woman? Gives the figure in red? She paused, thinking, then added, Benny Clough gives too many convenient stories. Hester Lomax. He is protective. Close to Ivy. Too quiet. A knock came at the door. When Miss Marple opened it, Sergeant Fletcher stood on the step. We've found something, he said. Behind the mirror. Chapter 10. Behind the mirror, the constable's torchlight flickered uncertainly across the dusty parlor of Maple House. Shadows leaping along the wall-papered walls like ghosts stirred from sleep. Sergeant Fletcher led Miss Marple inside, his brow furrowed, his boots scuffing softly on the worn rug. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Tilling, who found it, he said. She was cleaning the sitting room. Said she bumped the mirror accidentally and heard something shift. They stood, now before the old gilt-framed mirror that hung above the unused fireplace. It had been part of the house for decades, a heavy thing with lion's feet at the corners and a hairline crack near the edge. Hardly anyone looked into it anymore. Sergeant Fletcher pointed to the lower panel. Looks ordinary enough, doesn't it? But there's a latch hidden in the frame. He pressed gently, and with a soft pop, a thin wooden panel at the base of the mirror creaked open, revealing a hollow space behind the wall. Miss Marple leaned in. The air was close, tinged with something musty, old perfume, perhaps. Something sweet and rotting. Inside the hollow was a small leather-bound notebook, brittle at the edges, its pages filled in a neat, tight hand. Alongside it lay a crumpled silk scarf, deep red, faded and faintly torn, and just visible at one edge was a faint smear that could only be dried blood. Sergeant Fletcher removed the notebook carefully, glancing at the name scrawled across. The inside cover, I.W. Private. Not to be opened. His mouth twisted. That would be Ivy Walker. Miss Marple gave a small, steady nod. Let's read it. They moved to the small writing desk. Fletcher opened the book slowly, flattening the first page. The writing was orderly, but shaky in places, as if Ivy had written with care but trembling. Hands, June 4th. I don't know what made me buy this book. I suppose I needed somewhere to put the truth. He comes every Thursday now. At first he brought roses, said I reminded him of his mother. Then he stayed longer. Then he didn't knock at all. I told Hester once. She said to tell someone. I said it wouldn't help. That men like Lionel don't get punished. They just get admired. Charlotte knows. She saw us once. I saw it in her face. The disgust. Not at him, at me. Sometimes I think if I screamed loud enough into the mirror, it might shatter. But I only ever whisper. Fletcher exhaled deeply. Good Lord. There were more entries. Descriptions of meetings, of pressure, of threats, Lionel's temper. His veiled warnings. The way he touched things in the vicarage without permission, as though everything belonged to him. And then, the final entry, March 9th. Hester found out. I don't know how. I never told her, but she knew. She asked me if I wanted it to stop. I didn't answer. But she said she'd already made up her mind. The silence that followed was cold and immense. Miss Marple leaned back slowly in her chair. There it is. Fletcher looked at her. You think Hester Lomax? I think Hester is the only person who cared enough to act. who had both opportunity and motive, and who, unlike the rest of us, didn't believe in waiting for justice. Fletcher scratched his chin. But it's still only a theory. Miss Marple pointed to the scarf. Test that for blood. I suspect it will match the wound on Lionel Maddox's head. The red thread found at the scene? It's identical to the hem on Hester's gardening smock. The gloves? That's a red herring. Eliza kept them as guilt. But they're from years ago. The sergeant stared at her for a long moment, then said, quietly, "You're sure?" I'm sure Hester believed she was protecting someone she loved, and I think Ivy knew. That last line, she'd already made up her mind. That wasn't fear. That was surrender. Miss Marple looked up toward the mirror. People don't just look into mirrors, she murmured. They leave things there. Regret, grief, shadows of choices they couldn't speak aloud. Sergeant Fletcher closed the notebook. I'll bring her in. Quietly, Miss Marple nodded. Let her speak when she's ready. She's carried this too long in silence. Outside, the night hung soft over Rosehill. The church bell chimed once, low and mournful. A village still healing. A mirror no longer hiding, and an old woman at her window, knitting slowly, as the wind brushed gently through the trees. Chapter 11. A Garden of Secrets. It was early morning when Miss Marple arrived at the Rosehill allotments, a misty veil still hanging low over the hedgerows. The scent of damp earth and crushed rosemary filled the air as she stepped through the creaking gate and onto the gravel path. Hester Lomax was already there. Bent over her patch of chamomile and thyme. She wore her usual pale blue gardening smock, with a faint red thread dangling near the pocket. She didn't turn around when Miss Marple's footsteps approached. Instead, she said softly, "They found the notebook, didn't they?" There was no preamble, no evasion, only calm resignation. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And the scarf." Hester exhaled slowly, almost as if relieved. She leaned on her spade and looked up at the overcast sky. "Then I suppose it's over." Miss Marple moved beside her, hands folded neatly in front of her coat. "I don't believe in punishment for its own sake," she said gently. "But I do believe in truth, and in peace, especially for those who have lived too long without it." Hester gave a small, dry laugh. "Peace, that's a word I haven't earned, Miss Marple. You did what you thought was right, even if others might see it differently." Hester's eyes flicked to hers, tired, worn, but clear. "I knew what Lionel was. Ivy was too ashamed to tell me the whole of it, but I saw the bruises, the sudden silences, the flinching when he entered a room. And then one evening, I followed him to the vicarage. He walked in as if he owned the place." She paused, her voice tightening. I waited for over an hour. And when he came out, Ivy looked like a broken child." She clenched the spade, handle tightly. "That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking if I did nothing, what would happen next? And so I waited for the Institute's Thursday meeting. I knew he'd leave alone. Miss Marple said nothing. I met him near the back garden of Maple House," Hester continued, voice steadier now. "He was smug. Told me I was a bitter old thing. Said Ivy liked the attention." Her lips trembled, and then he turned to go. "Back in, and I had the trowel in my coat. I didn't plan it, but it was heavy and sharp, and I only meant to stop him." There was silence. The garden seemed to hold its breath. "I wiped everything I touched," she said, "but the scarf slipped from my sleeve. I didn't notice until the next day." She looked down at her worn gloves, speckled with soil. "I never meant for anyone else to suffer. Eliza, Ivy, I didn't want this to spread." Miss Marple reached out and gently touched her arm. It already had, dear. Long before you acted. Secrets like these. They don't stay buried. They root themselves into the very soil. Hester closed her eyes and opened them again. Will you be telling Fletcher? I believe you will, Miss Marple said gently. In your own words. A silence stretched between them, soft and respectful, and then Hester bent back down, placing her gloves carefully on the edge of the herb bed. If I must go, she murmured, I'll go with my hands clean, and my garden tended. That afternoon, Sergeant Fletcher arrived at Hester's cottage, where she sat with her coat folded neatly on her lap. She offered no resistance, only a quiet request. Let me write one letter before I go. Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the rain begin to patter lightly on the glass. Ivy had not come outside that day, but the vicarage windows were open, and through them floated the soft notes of a piano. A song played, hesitant at first, then fuller. A hymn, something sorrowful and full of yearning. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Some wounds healed in silence. Others required the sharp edge of truth, but all of them, every last one, required time. Chapter 12. The letter and the lily pond. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the village of Rosehill bathed in a fresh silvery light. Dew clung to every leaf and gatepost. Birds sang again, tentatively at first, as if unsure whether the world had truly calmed. Miss Marple walked to the vicarage with a small envelope in her gloved hand. It was addressed in careful script. Miss Ivy Walker, Rosehill Vicarage, Private Hester Lomax, had written it just before Sergeant Fletcher escorted her into custody. No one had read the contents, but Miss Marple had promised to deliver it, not for the sake of confession, but for healing. She found Ivy seated in the vicarage's back garden, near the lily pond, a shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. The water, calm and still, reflected her pale face and the bare branches above. When she turned, her expression was unreadable. Miss Marple, I brought you this. Miss Marple handed her the envelope. Ivy stared at it. Her hands trembled. Is it from her? Yes. A long pause followed. Ivy didn't open it immediately. She held it close, as if it were something fragile, something that might break if handled too quickly. I knew she knew, Ivy said quietly, but she never said a word. Just brought me little things. Biscuits, chamomile, a new book once. Never asked, just stayed. Miss Marple sat beside her on the stone bench. Sometimes love doesn't ask, she said gently. Sometimes it simply protects. Ivy turned the envelope over, then slowly opened it. Her eyes moved across the lines, her lips parting slightly. As she read, a frown appeared first, then something softer, something that cracked open, like the beginning of a sob. She folded the letter back with shaking fingers and pressed it to her chest. She says she did it for me, she whispered. No. She says she never regretted it, only that I had to carry the shame alone for so long. A bird chirped in the hedgerow nearby, unaware of the weight of the moment. Tears slipped down Ivy's face. I should feel horror. That she killed him. But I don't. I feel like someone finally heard me scream. Miss Marple reached into her bag and pulled out a fresh linen handkerchief. She offered it wordlessly, and Ivy took it with a broken laugh. There was a girl in my school, Ivy said after a long silence. She once fell into the lily pond during a picnic. Everyone laughed until she didn't come up. We pulled her out just in time. But later she told me the water was so still, she'd thought it was safe, like glass, like nothing bad could happen under something so calm. Miss Marple looked out at the pond, where the lily floated like white paper. Dreams. We all believe in calm, she said softly, until we learn what it hides. Ivy turned to her. Will she go to prison? That's for the courts to decide, Miss Marple said. But whatever happens, she will no longer be alone in carrying the truth. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees and sending tiny ripples across the pond's surface. Want to visit her? Ivy said suddenly. When I'm ready. I want to tell her thank you for everything she never said. Miss Marple smiled gently. I think that would mean more to her than you know. They sat together for a long time in silence. No questions, no more explanations. Just the stillness of water and the sound of healing beginning. Chapter 13. The echoes of Eliza's past, though Rosehill had returned to its ordinary rhythms, church bells, market chatter, and clipped hedges, there lingered an undercurrent of unease. For Miss Marple, the case was not quite closed. Something still felt unresolved. The murderer had confessed, yes. But Eliza Finch, the woman who discovered the body and whose fear had shaken the village, remained an enigma. On a mild Thursday afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Beeches, where Eliza lived with her elder brother Harold. The estate, though impressive, had aged ungracefully. Ivy clung to the gates, and dead leaves carpeted the drive. Harold greeted her stiffly in the drawing-room, a man whose air of brittle dignity barely masked his irritation. I suppose you've come to poke around, he said, adjusting his tie. To whisper about poor Eliza. I've come to listen, Miss Marple replied simply, to what no one else has bothered to hear. He frowned, clearly uncertain how to respond. Eliza is resting. She doesn't speak to many, but she does speak, doesn't she? Miss Marple asked gently. She screamed, after all, when she found Lionel's body. Harold's lips pressed into a thin line. She's delicate, always has been, since we were children. Miss Marple tilted her head. Delicacy is one thing, but trauma is another. I wonder if you've ever asked her what frightened her most that night finding the body, or what she remembered because of it. There was a long silence. At last, Harold sighed. She had. An episode after the war. Something happened. She won't tell me what, but she started seeing things. Talking in her sleep. I brought her back to Rosehill to recover. And she never left, Miss Marple murmured. Harold stood. If you wish to see her, she's in the conservatory. But I warn you she may not make sense. Miss Marple rose and followed him through a side corridor to a glass-walled room, where warm sunlight streamed over potted geraniums and faded cushions. Eliza sat by the window, her hair in soft disarray, her hands clasped around a silver locket. She looked up and saw Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. You're the one from the garden. Yes, Miss Marple said gently, sitting beside her. And you're the one who saw the truth first. Eliza blinked, and her fingers clutched the locket tighter. He said my memory was broken, she whispered. He said I imagined it all. Who? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected. Lionel. At the hospital, just after the war. I was nursing then. There was a girl who wouldn't speak. Bruises. A frightened look. Lionel visited her every evening. Said he was helping. But she told me things. Then one day she disappeared. Miss Marple's heart tightened. This was it. I told the matron, Eliza continued. But Lionel said I'd misunderstood, that I was overwrought. They dismissed me. Harold brought me home. I tried to forget. And when you saw him in the village again? I remembered. All of it. But no one believed me then either. So I stayed quiet. Until the blood on the carpet, and his eyes staring up through the glass. Her voice trailed off. Miss Marple reached out and touched her hand. You were the first person in Rosehill to truly see him. And you weren't mad, Eliza. You were right. A tear slipped down Eliza's cheek. But this time, she didn't wipe it away. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a letter. It was addressed to a former matron in Surrey, at a now-closed hospital. Inside, she enclosed a copy of her notes, a list of names, and a question. What became of Nurse Eliza Finch's missing patient in 1947? There were still threads to tug, still voices buried behind silence and shame. And Miss Marple, with the patience of age and the clarity of justice, intended to follow them all. Chapter 14. The visitor at dusk. It was nearing dusk when the knock came. Miss Marple had just finished her evening tea, a modest spread of scones, lemon curd, and a small tin of sardines for the cat, when the sharp rap echoed through the hallway of Danemead. She rose slowly, her joints a little stiff in the cool evening air, and opened the front door. A figure stood just beyond the ivy-draped threshold. "Forgive the hour," said the woman softly. She was perhaps in her late 50s, hair tightly pinned beneath a dark cloche hat, her coat clean but worn. "I believe you sent me a letter." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained neutral. "You must be Matron Edeline Winter from Surrey." "I was," the woman replied, "a long time ago." Miss Marple stepped aside and gestured her in. "Please, come through to the parlor." They sat in companionable silence at first. Miss Marple poured a second pot of tea, added an extra log to the fireplace, and folded her hands. Matron Winter removed her gloves carefully. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she said at last. "But your letter stirred things. I've kept them down for decades. Sometimes the past knocks," Miss Marple said. "Even at dusk." The matron smiled faintly at that. "You asked about a girl, one that disappeared. Quiet, bruised. Eliza Finch believed something was wrong." "She did more than believe it," Miss Marple said. "She carried the knowledge in silence, because no one would listen." The matron sighed. "Her name was Sarah Greaves, 15 years old. Brought in after an accident, supposedly. But the injuries, they didn't fit the story. She was terrified. I began to suspect something. Then one day she vanished. The hospital said her family retrieved her. But there were no records. And Lionel Hunter, he had access to every ward." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did you investigate?" "I tried," the matron whispered. "I asked questions. But I was warned off. There was a man, well connected. Someone Lionel referred to in vague terms. I couldn't prove anything, and I didn't want to lose my post. That was cowardly, I know." "Not cowardly," Miss Marple said gently. "Merely human." The matron looked up, her eyes damp. "But I remember Eliza. Earnest, watchful. She saw it too. I dismissed her, thinking her unstable. But she was right all along." There was a long pause. Only the crackle of the fire broke the quiet. "Do you think," the matron asked carefully, "that what happened to Lionel was justice?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the window, where the last golden light was fading. "Justice is a strange thing, Miss Winter. Courts are made for facts, but life is made of shadows. I believe the truth finds its way, eventually, through mirrors, through voices, through those who never forget." The matron nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad I came." Before she left, she pressed a slim folder into Miss Marple's hand. "I kept this. Don't ask why. Perhaps I always knew someone would need it." Miss Marple waited until the door had closed and the woman had vanished down the lane. Then she returned to the fire and opened the folder. Inside was a photograph, faded but clear, of a frightened girl with a bruise under her eye. Below it, a short medical file, and one name handwritten in red pencil: Sarah Greaves, missing. March 1947. Miss Marple folded the file closed and whispered aloud to the empty room. She was never forgotten. Chapter 15. The unspoken witness Rosehill's rhythms had begun to slow with the onset of autumn. Mornings grew crisper. Shopkeepers hung lanterns in their windows. Children returned to school in their polished shoes and knotted ties. But inside many of the homes, behind lace curtains and flickering fireplaces, conversations about the murder still whispered like wind through a keyhole. Miss Marple, however, was focused on something deeper, the thread that had remained untouched. Eliza Finch's memories had opened a door. The matron's file had cast light into that darkness. But what had become of Sarah Greaves? That was the question she turned over and over in her mind as she sat, knitting untouched, on her sitting-room sofa. And then, as if called forth by her thoughts, there was a knock at the door. This time it was Inspector Cray. His face was tight, with polite concern, but Miss Marple knew that expression well. It was the look of a man both curious and irritated, like someone who suspects a cat has walked off with his fish. "May I come in?" he asked. "Of course," she smiled, stepping aside. "I've just put the kettle on." When they were seated and the tea poured, Cray got to the point. "You've been asking questions about someone named Sarah Greaves, and about events that happened long before this murder. I must ask, why?" Miss Marple stirred her tea calmly. "Because the roots of evil are often old, Inspector, and I believe this murder grew from poisoned soil." Cray exhaled, clearly fighting his instinct to dismiss her. "Miss Marple, we have a confession, a credible motive, a timeline. Your Eliza Finch may have had a tragic history, but it doesn't change the facts." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it may change the meaning of them." He tilted his head. "How so?" "Tell me," she said, "why was Lionel Hunter really in Rosehill?" "He told people he was planning to write a book on post-war trauma. That may have been partly true, but a man like Lionel doesn't come to a village like this without a reason." "Go on," Cray said, narrowing his eyes. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Because someone here knew, or had seen something, or had a piece of his past in their pocket. And I believe that someone tried to warn him they remembered." Cray hesitated. "And who would that be?" Miss Marple reached for the file matron. Winter had left. She opened it to the photograph of Sarah Greaves. Cray studied it, silent. "She looks familiar," he muttered. "Wait," and then the color drained slightly from his face. "I've seen her." Miss Marple nodded. "You have. She's in Rosehill, living under another name." There was a silence so deep it hummed. "Who?" Cray asked, his voice low. "She works at the bakery," Miss Marple said softly. "Goes by the name Mrs. Grace. Hollow, keeps to herself. But when she saw Lionel in the square 3 weeks ago, she dropped her entire tray of scones." Cray leaned back, stunned. "She never came forward, never said a word, because she thought no one would believe her, and because the fear never truly left her." Miss Marple stood and walked to her bookshelf. She pulled out a slim red diary, opened it, and removed a page from the back. It was a signed letter, dated from the old hospital. Matron Winter. Verified her real identity, there's no doubt. Cray took the letter, his fingers tight on the paper. "We'll need to speak to her." "Gently," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And perhaps, at long last, let her speak freely." That afternoon, the bell above Hollander's bakery jingled as Miss Marple entered. The smell of sugar and yeast hung in the air. Behind the counter, Grace Hollow froze. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I've come for a loaf of brown bread, and perhaps, if you're willing, a conversation." The woman stared at her for a long moment. Her hands trembled. Then, softly, she whispered, "You?" "No, don't you?" Miss Marple reached into her handbag and placed the photograph on the counter. "Not everything," she said gently. "Only what matters." Grace looked at the photo, then at Miss Marple, her eyes shining with both terror and relief. "Didn't kill him," she said, barely audible. Miss Marple nodded. "I know." Chapter 16. A truth too long buried. Grace Hollow sat with her back straight and her hands folded tightly on her lap. as though years of guarding herself had trained every muscle to remain contained. The little sitting room above Hollander's. Bakery was plain, pale yellow wallpaper, a teapot on a doily, and the window that overlooked the village green dot. Miss Marple sat opposite her, patient and quiet. For a while, Grace said nothing. She stared out the window, eyes fixed on something far beyond Rosehill, beyond the trees and the hedgerows, beyond the years she had spent sewing pain shut with silence. Then, finally, her voice came brittle and low. I was 14 when I met him. He was charming. He smiled too much. He remembered my name when no one else did. He said I was clever, special, beautiful. Miss Marple said nothing, just listened, the way only someone truly kind could. Grace's voice trembled. It started with extra books. Letters slipped into my locker. And came the private talks. She swallowed. He told me no one would believe me if I ever told. That I'd be punished, expelled, that my mother would be ashamed. So I said, nothing. She drew in a long breath. One night, things went too far, and I ran. I fell down a staircase. That's how I ended up in hospital. They said it was an accident. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And that was where you met Eliza Finch. Grace's eyes softened. She knew something wasn't right. She never said it out loud, but she looked at me like she knew. She left me little notes in the chapel, Bible verses about justice, courage. I still have them. And then you vanished, Miss Marple said softly. They said I was transferred to a clinic in Bath, Grace whispered. But there was no clinic. A man, well-dressed, confident, collected me. I never saw Eliza again. Tears shimmered now, but did not fall. He told me I was lucky, that if I kept quiet, I could have a quiet life, a different name. Small cottage and a job, and no one would ever need to know. Miss Marple's voice was barely a murmur. And you took it. I was a child, Grace said quietly. And I was so afraid. Silence fell over the room again. The evening light turned the yellow wallpaper golden. Finally, Miss Marple leaned forward. Grace, did you see Lionel Hunter in the days before his death? Grace nodded slowly. He came into the bakery, didn't recognize me at first. But then he did. I saw it in his eyes. And I think he panicked. Did he speak to you? No, but he left in a hurry. And that night, someone threw a rock through my window. No note, just a warning. Miss Marple frowned. Did you tell the police? I didn't dare. Miss Marple's mind was working like a needle threading its way through silk. You weren't the only one he feared. Grace looked up, startled. What do you mean? Eliza Finch began hearing voices behind her mirror, just after she saw Lionel again. Not madness, memory. She knew what he had done, just as you did, but her way of remembering was different. Grace whispered. She wanted to confront. Him? She did confront him, Miss Marple said. The night before his death, they argued in the woods behind her cottage. A neighbor heard it. Then she killed him? Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Eliza loved justice, but she feared violence. I believe she went there to shame him, to force him to admit what he'd done. Then who? Miss Marple stood slowly. That's what I intend to discover. But you, my dear, have taken the most courageous step of all. Grace's voice cracked. I'm tired of hiding. Miss Marple placed a warm hand on hers. Then let the truth walk beside you now. It's waited long enough. That night, Miss Marple returned to Danemead and sat at her writing desk. She lit a lamp, drew out a fresh sheet of paper, and wrote 4 names at the top. Lionel Hunter, Eliza Finch, Sarah Greaves, Grace Hollow. The unknown man. Beneath them, she added a line. What connects them isn't just the past. It's who. knew the past, and feared it coming to light. She tapped the pen twice against her chin. Then she circled the last name, the unknown man. Chapter 17. The Man Behind the Curtain. The morning mist in Rosehill hung low and heavy, veiling hedgerows and chimney pots alike. The village was quiet, as if holding its breath. But inside her parlor at Danemead, Miss Marple was quite awake, and the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. She sat beside a notebook, her fountain pen uncapped, the name she had written the night before still fresh in blue ink. Lionel Hunter had returned not just to write, but to cover. Eliza Finch had remembered what she wasn't supposed to. Grace Hollow, née Sarah Greaves, had survived, and witness Dot. And then there was the unaccounted-for figure in the whole story. Someone who had knowledge of the past, not second-hand gossip, but deep, direct involvement. Someone with the ability to threaten, manipulate, or even remove those who knew the truth. Dot. It was not Lionel who had thrown a rock through Grace Hollow's window. Dot, it was someone protecting Lionel. Or more precisely, someone protecting themselves. Dot. Miss Marple rose from her chair and opened a drawer. From it, she pulled a letter she had quietly requested from the county archives 2 weeks ago, long before Lionel's death. Dot. It was a list of hospital trustees and patrons from the year Sarah Greaves had disappeared. And there, 2 names below. Lionel's father, Sir Edward Hunter, was the one she had been waiting to see. Reverend Jonah Maddox, the vicar of Rosehill at the time, now retired, living just outside the village. Quiet, respected, never married. Miss Marple put on her coat. It was time to speak with the man behind the curtain. The vicarage at Withersfield. The cottage was modest but well kept. A trailing rosebush by the gate, a garden chair on the porch. The door was opened by a woman in her 50s, who introduced herself as Mrs. Clinton, the Reverend's housekeeper. "He's not well these days," she said. "Hard of hearing. Doesn't take visitors usually." Miss Marple gave a warm smile and passed her a card. "Tell him it's Jane Marple from St. Mary Mead. We crossed paths once during a diocesan dinner in 1953. I shan't stay long." Mrs. Clinton nodded and disappeared inside. Moments later, she returned with a reluctant nod. "He'll see you." Miss Marple stepped inside. The old vicar sat in a deep armchair near a window, wrapped in a knitted shawl. His once proud frame had diminished, but his eyes, pale and clever, still flickered with life. "Miss Marple," he said, voice dry, "I remember you." The woman with the sharp eyes and the softer words. She inclined her head. "That's kind of you to say. Let's not pretend," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "You're not here about church records or tea recipes." "No," Miss Marple said. "I'm here about Sarah Greaves and Lionel Hunter." There was a long pause. A clock ticked in the corner. "I was young," he said at last, "and stupid, and far too afraid of powerful men." "You knew what Lionel was doing." "I suspected," he whispered. "We all did, but Sir Edward was a trustee, and Lionel had protection. There were whispers about other girls. I tried to raise concerns once. Was told I'd be removed from my post, quietly. Did you ever meet Sarah?" He nodded slowly. "Once. She was bruised, silent, eyes like glass. I tried to speak to the hospital matron, but she was transferred the next week, or so they said." "You told no one?" "I wrote a letter, anonymous, to the diocesan office. Nothing came of it." Miss Marple looked him full in the eyes. "But you recognized Lionel when he returned?" The Reverend's fingers trembled slightly. "I thought I was seeing a ghost." "And Eliza Finch?" "She came to me 2 weeks before his death. Said she knew. Sighed she was going to confront him." "And you let her go?" "I begged her not to. I said leave the past, but she said Some voices never die, Reverend. They just wait to be heard. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Did you kill Lionel Hunter, Reverend? The room fell still. No, he whispered. But I knew someone would. As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. A car, parked not far from the gate, black, unmarked. The man inside, late 50s, silver hair, dark sunglasses, pretended to read a newspaper. She had seen him before. He had come into the village shortly after Lionel's arrival, claimed to be a publisher, but he never spoke to anyone. He never bought books. He was watching. Miss Marple returned home and locked her gate. The truth was closer now, almost near enough to touch. But someone, somewhere, still had a very real reason to keep it buried. Chapter 18. A stranger at the gate. The storm had passed in the night, but the scent of wet earth still lingered in the hedgerows. Morning brought a brittle, wind-swept quiet to Rosehill, the kind that arrives after something shifts beneath the surface. Even if the villagers couldn't quite say what at Danemead, Miss Marple sat by the window with her knitting, but her hands were still. Her eyes, sharp and thoughtful, were trained on the lane. The black car was parked there, again. Same model, same man inside. He wore different sunglasses today, darker, glancing at a pocket watch every few minutes, waiting, watching. Miss Marple. Rose set aside her knitting and boiled a fresh kettle. She prepared a second cup, placed 2 shortbread biscuits on a china plate, and stepped out her garden gate. The man didn't flinch as she approached, but she saw the flicker in his brow. Not surprise, calculation. "How do you do?" she said kindly. "I couldn't help noticing you've taken a liking to Rosehill." He hesitated. "Just passing through." "Oh, we don't often get passers through who sit still for hours," she smiled. "I thought you might like some tea." There was silence between them. Then, to her mild surprise, the man opened the door and stepped out. He took the cup gently. "Thank you." Miss Marple motioned to the low stone wall. "Do have a seat." He sat. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said. "I am. And you are?" The man sipped his tea before answering. "Call me Mr. Glenister." "That doesn't sound real," Miss Marple replied gently. "It isn't." She nodded. "And what brings a man with no real name to watch a quiet lane in a quiet village?" Glenister smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for someone. That's all." "Oh, I believe you. But not in the way you mean." He studied her, lips tightening. Then he leaned closer, his tone quiet but firm. "Miss Marple, I know you've been asking questions, visiting people, uncovering history. I'm here to tell you, carefully, that it may be best to leave the past where it is." Miss Marple's eyes didn't waver. "The past has a way of walking back into rooms uninvited." "She was supposed to stay hidden," he said under his breath. "Change her name, forget, move on." "You're speaking of Sarah Greaves." "Her real name isn't important anymore." "It is," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but resolute. "It is to her, and to the girl she used to be." Glenister stared into the steam of his tea. "If you dig further, you'll bring danger to her, and to others." "She's already in danger," Miss Marple said. "The broken window, the letter. Someone is trying to frighten her into silence. Again, she's not the only one who could be hurt." Miss Marple took a long, quiet breath. "Tell me, did you work for the ministry? Special branch?" He glanced up, startled. "I may be old," she continued, "but the signs are easy enough to see. Your silence, your posture, the fact that you're still carrying weight for an operation buried decades ago." He looked away. "Sarah wasn't the only one," she added. "Was she?" He stood. "You've had your warning. Take it seriously." He placed the empty teacup back on the plate. "I liked the biscuits," he said, voice softening for a moment. Then he walked back to his car, started the engine, and drove away without another word. That evening Grace Hollow came to Danemead just before sunset. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she held an envelope in her hands. "I found this on my doorstep," she said, handing it to Miss Marple. Inside was a newspaper clipping, old and yellowing. It was a report from 1947 about a girl named Sarah Greaves, who had jumped from a hospital window and had been presumed drowned. "But I didn't," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I ran. They let the world think I died. I hid, changed everything. And someone wants to remind you that they still know," Miss Marple said, reading the note scrawled across the article. "You only get to die once, Sarah. Stay dead. Miss." Marple folded the paper gently. "This isn't about Lionel anymore," she said. "It never was, really." "Then what is it about?" Grace whispered. Miss Marple rose and lit a lamp. The shadows in the room receded slightly. "It's about the people who let him do it," she said, "and who fear what will happen when that truth finally comes out." Chapter 19. The letter in the church pew, a small stone church of St. Aldhelm's, was empty, save for the faint scent of beeswax and the distant echo of pigeons rustling in the eaves. It was late afternoon, the hour when the sun slants through the stained glass and casts jewel-toned patches on the ancient flagstones. Miss Marple sat in the fourth pew from the front, just beneath the window of St. Michael triumphing over the dragon. She was not there for prayer. Not today. She was watching. Earlier that morning, the vicar, Reverend Fielding, had telephoned her. His voice was quiet, nearly a whisper. "Miss Marple, I believe something was left behind. In a pew, not meant for me. You should see it." And now, beneath the curled and fading hymnal, Miss Marple found it. A letter. The envelope was unmarked. No name, no address. But it had been folded twice, carefully. She slipped it open and read the contents slowly. To whom it may concern. "You won't find my name on any record. But I knew what was happening, long before the papers ever did. Lionel Hunter was not acting alone. He was part of a scheme, a quiet one, carefully protected. Young women disappeared. Not always forever. Some returned, changed. Others didn't. They were taken to rehabilitation homes, but they were really holding places. Some girls were used for favors, others for silence. I saw files. I took copies. I still have some of them. Not all. One girl, Sarah Greaves, ran. We were told she jumped. But I knew that was a lie. I believe she is still alive. And I believe someone is trying to finish what they started. If anything happens to me, go to the safe at the back of the forge. Ask for the horseshoe marked C. You can trust Marple. She always sees more than she says." A friend in the dust. Miss Marple folded the letter with great care. Her face was unreadable, but her mind was racing. A network, protected. Disappearances no one questioned. Documents hidden behind horseshoes. She sat there for a moment longer, listening to the creak of wood and stone. Then she rose and walked calmly down the aisle toward the rear of the church. As she reached the vestibule, a figure stirred in the shadows. Miss Marple. It was Sergeant Blunt. She hadn't heard him arrive. But he was holding something in his hand, a photograph, faded, curled at the corners. "I went back to the old hospital records," he said. "This was buried under a misfiled name. I think it's your girl." She took the photograph. It was a black and white image. A girl, about 16, standing beside a bench. Her eyes were wide. Her hands were bandaged. "I've seen her," Miss Marple said softly. "She's Grace Hollow." Blunt exhaled. "Then it's true." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And I believe someone, perhaps more than one person, wants to ensure she never speaks." Blunt looked down at the photograph, then back at her. "What do you want me to do?" Miss Marple didn't hesitate. "Go to the forge. Ask about the horseshoe-marked C. Whatever's hidden, there may be the last piece we need. And you?" She tucked the letter into her handbag. "I'll speak to Grace. She deserves to know that someone at least believed her, and that the truth is nearly in sight." They left together, each walking towards separate threads of the mystery. Threads that, at last, were beginning to tighten. Chapter 20. The horseshoe secret the forge at the edge of Rosehill had stood for over a century, soot-streaked, iron-scented, and thick with the residue of a time when horses outnumbered motor cars. It was run now by Gideon Clark, a quiet man with large hands and a heavy brow, who spoke as little as possible and never asked questions. Sergeant Blunt arrived just before noon. The forge was hot, a single red coal glowing under the anvil, and the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel echoed in the smoky air. Gideon looked up. "Something I can help with, Sergeant?" Blunt took a breath. "I need to see your wall." "The one with the decorative horseshoes." Gideon paused mid-swing. "That's just for tourists. I'm not here for tourism." Gideon wiped his brow with a rag and set the hammer down. He led Blunt toward a wooden panel mounted behind the counter. Arranged in a neat arc were 24 old horseshoes, each mounted with a brass tack. Most were unmarked, but at the far end was one that bore a small, scratched C. Blunt reached up and gave it a firm tug. Nothing. Then he pushed it to the left. Soft click echoed behind the panel. The wall popped open. An inch. Inside was a metal lockbox, covered in soot and cobwebs. Blunt turned back to Gideon. "You know anything about this?" The blacksmith shook his head. "Came with the building. I always figured someone would come for it one day." Blunt nodded and opened the box carefully. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Medical forms, police reports, confidential memos stamped with official crests, and photographs. Some blurred, some chillingly clear. At the bottom was a list of names. Women. All with dates beside them. Some marked returned, others missing. A few were circled, and there, among them, was the name Sarah Greaves, circled, with one word next to it. Silenced? Blunt felt a chill crawl over his neck. This wasn't just Lionel Hunter's depravity. This was organized, hidden behind the veil of respectability. A network of men, powerful men, protecting each other at the expense of the vulnerable. He closed the box, cradling it like fragile treasure. "This will need protection," he said quietly. Gideon nodded once. "Whatever that is, it's been sleeping a long time." "Not anymore," Blunt muttered, already walking out into the sunlight. Back at Danemead, Miss Marple poured tea for Grace Hollow, who sat across from her with trembling hands. "You said?" "Someone knew," Grace whispered. "Someone had proof?" Miss Marple handed her a handkerchief. "Yes, my dear. And that someone left it in the forge, perhaps years ago, perhaps recently, knowing one day it would be needed." Grace leaned back, her eyes brimming with silent tears. "For so long, I thought I imagined it. That maybe I deserved what happened." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but firm. "You did not. Evil has a way of planting doubt. It's how it survives. But you were never to blame." A knock interrupted them. Sergeant Blunt stood in the doorway with the box. "We have it," he said. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then we're nearly there," she said. "Now we only need to know who buried it, and who is still willing to kill to keep it buried." Chapter 21. The Garden of Whispers, the garden behind Danemead, was a tangle of roses, lavender, and thyme. It was Miss Marple's favorite place to think and to listen. People spoke more freely near flowers, perhaps because they believed. No one truly listened to whispers among the bees. This morning, Grace Hollow sat with her hands clasped in her lap, as if holding something fragile. Miss Marple had made her a pot of chamomile tea, and they sat together beneath the twisted bough of an apple tree. Grace broke the silence. "I remember the mirror." Miss Marple turned gently. "The one at Moorlands?" She nodded. "It was two-way. Behind it, there was a room. I didn't realize at first. But I knew, after a while, someone was watching, sometimes whispering." "Who?" "I think it was Mr. Hunter, but someone else, too. Someone older. The voice was deeper, colder. Miss..." Marple's gaze narrowed slightly. "Did you ever hear a name?" Grace looked away. "Just once. A slip. One of them called the other chairman." Miss Marple stiffened, not visibly, but with a subtle inhale that only someone very observant would notice. That word meant power, structure, something organized. Across the garden, Sergeant Blunt was leaning against the trellis, holding the box of documents like a coiled snake. He'd read more of them now, enough to know that what they were dealing with went far beyond a local scandal. One name appeared repeatedly: Sir Reginald Allerton, Member of Parliament, local patron of the arts, celebrated war hero. And if the documents were correct, silent financier of several rehabilitation homes, including Moorlands House, where Grace had been held. Blunt stepped forward. "Do you think it could really be Allerton?" Miss Marple set down her teacup. "His name is there. His influence is undeniable. But men like Allerton rarely get their own hands dirty. He would have had someone do his work for him. Someone with a clean smile and filthy fingers." "Like Lionel Hunter," Grace whispered. "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "But Lionel was a servant. A willing one, yes, but a pawn all the same. The voice behind the mirror, that wasn't his." Blunt frowned. "Then who?" Miss Marple stood slowly, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "There's one person we haven't looked at closely. Someone who inserted himself into every conversation, every investigation. Always helpful. Always just there enough." Blunt's brow furrowed. "You mean..." "Yes," Miss Marple said calmly. "Superintendent Hawley." Later that day, Rose Hill Police Station Superintendent Hawley sat in his office, the door ajar, a cup of tea going cold beside a neatly stacked blotter. His face was composed, the very picture of dutiful calm. But his eyes, always slightly narrowed, watched every passerby like a hawk behind glass. He didn't see Miss Marple arrive. He didn't hear Blunt enter. But when he looked up and saw them both standing there, Marple, silent and composed, and Blunt holding the iron lockbox, his fingers curled slightly, then stilled. "Is this a social call?" he asked, voice light. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I'm afraid not." Blunt placed the box on the desk. "Do you recognize this?" "Sir?" Hawley didn't blink. "Can't say I do." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You should. You were in charge of the Moorlands closure inquiry, weren't you? And yet none of these documents ever made it into the record." Hawley smiled faintly. "Unsubstantiated. Old rumors." Blunt opened the box. "Photographs, names, payments, all in your handwriting." Hawley stood very slowly, and then, quite suddenly, he ran. He darted past Blunt, knocking over a chair, and was through the hallway door before either of them could move. But Rose Hill's police station was small, and his freedom didn't last long. 2 constables had him pinned before he reached the gate.